Thank you guys very much for coming. This is an awesome room. My name is John Birdsall, and I'm going to be sort of asking questions of these guys. I'm a food writer in Oakland, and I am terrified of science. So in some ways, I'm kind of I'll be like the devil's advocate. But it's no pose. I'm actually quite intimidated by science and quite impressed by what these guys have done. So I'd like to, I guess just some practical things. So we'll be talking on stage until about 12:30, and then we will take questions from you guys. And I hear there's going to be some people with some microphones who will ask the questions. So we'll let you know when that happens. And then I guess afterwards, outside, Kenji is going to be doing a book signing. So that will happen at about 1 o'clock outside. Great. So I wanted to introduce these two gentlemen. At the end is Adam Rogers. He's a deputy editor of Wired. He edits features for the print magazine and manages the editing of long-form stories for the digital edition. He had a feature called The Angel's Share, which is a detective story about a mysterious fungus that lives on whiskey fumes. It won the
Give away who did it.
It won the 2011 AAS Kavli Science Journalism Award for magazine writing, and was the inspiration for his book Proof, which we're talking about today, The Science of Booze, which won the 2015 IACP Prize and was shortlisted for the Penn E.O. Wilson Science Writing Award. Rogers was also a writer and correspondent for Wired Science, a TV show produced by the magazine and PBS in 2007. He was also the host of The Storyboard, a Wired podcast, and before joining Wired, Adam was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT and a writer and reporter at Newsweek.
Hello.
And Kenji López-Alt is the managing culinary director of Serious Eats, a columnist for Cooking Light and author of the James Beard Award-winning, I was there when it happened, so I can say that this is true. New York Times bestseller, The Food Lab, Better Home Cooking Through Science, which was named the IACP Book of the Year for 2015.
You got to trump the cookbook award, right? I get it. I didn't win a Beard Award, you guys. I got it. Thank you. It's fine. Jerks.
This is taking
longer than you expected. Yes.
An unexpected direction. Kenji's a native of the Northeast U.S. He worked his way up through the ranks of some of Boston's finest restaurants. He studied science and engineering, also at MIT, right?
Also at MIT.
And is a former senior editor at Cooks Illustrated and America's Test Kitchen. Oh, and I also wanted to mention the influences. I kind of asked these guys who influenced them. So Kenji, no big surprise, Harold McGee and Shirley Corrier, two great food science writers. Also Don Herbert, AKA TV's Mr. Wizard. So keep that in mind.
And Richard Dean Anderson.
Yeah, thank you. Wait, that's one of mine. I want that one.
Yeah, and as for Adam, he cited the 1980s magazine Science. Also Paul Harrington, who was a Wired columnist. And does he still write stuff for Wired?
He doesn't. I think he still bartends.
Okay. Anyway, he wrote a column, I guess, called Cocktail for the old Hot Wired site in the 1990s, and a book, Cocktail, a drinks Bible for the 21st century. So I wanted to give a little sort of behind-the-scenes story about how I was asked to come and talk to these gentlemen on this panel. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but there is a food site called Food 52, which is awesome. Every year they do a cookbook bracket where they take a distinguished handful of all the cookbooks published in the previous year, and they ask distinguished writers, I suppose, to review them bracket style. And they'll sort of pit one book against another, and they won't be books that are necessarily the same. So it's kind of challenging. And so Kenji's book was in the Piglet bracket last year. He won the first round, didn't survive the second round. After the competition ended and a winner was named, two food writers in New York, Kat Kinsman and Helen Rosner, sort of had a conversation about the piglet. And a couple things jumped out at me. They said, this is Helen Rosner, who's the editor of Eater, who's the long-form features editor of Eater. She said, when I was reading Lauren Collins' Judgment, I had this epiphany that the tension between rigor and soul is the core of all arguments I've ever had about cookbooks. And the author who, the writer who caused Kenji to lose the second round sort of cited the prescriptivism of the book. And there's this conversation that ensued that sort of pitted, it's sort of the classic humanities versus science argument. And the question is, that I wanted to come with is science the enemy of soul in books about food and cooking? So that's where I'd like to start.
All right, so we're good here, everybody.
And I also wanted to say that these guys are, in a way, in sort of hostile territory, because Berkeley, right, is
I live here. Wait a minute.
Like one of the great founding places for like the humanities approach to cooking, the sort of style of cooking, sort of championed by Alice Waters and Chez Panisse, is all about storytelling, about food in a very sort of English majory way. And so I wondered if, first of all, if you guys feel like you're in hostile territory. I mean, do you feel like
now?
I've come with an agenda. If you guys feel like what you do is sort of, hostile to the traditional way that we think about sort of books about food and beverages, which are based in, very familiar, comforting stories that involve history, that involve place, that involve travel. So Adam, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that I had on my mind while I was writing, while I've been thinking about the subject matter for the years before I wrote the book. I wouldn't be interested in it if it didn't have theater, and if it didn't have place, if it didn't have an emotional connection for me. I think the first thing if it's not the first thing, it's the second thing I talk about in the book is like my grandmother making martinis for my mom,
right,
in front of me, and my grandmother who was a professor at UC Berkeley. So hostile territory, really? Come at me. Is this how you people are going to play? I get to play freight and salvage, and it's a hard room. Who'd have thunk? But for me, the way that you investigate and understand what you described as soul just now, the most important way to have an interaction with what Paracelsus called the book of nature, is to understand it, is to investigate it, to ask questions about it, to unpack it. And I think, and just to go serious liberal arts for a second, the kind of violence with which, like, Francis Bacon wanted to understand nature is not the only way to understand science and nature. You can have what Evelyn Fox Keller described as a feeling for the organism, that you can interact with what you study at a very emotional and soulful level, and that by understanding it, you deepen the significance of that interaction. And that really is what I was coming from, is I wanted to know what was in those bottles behind the bar since I was a little kid. Why are they different colors? Why are they different shapes? And then when I was old enough to taste them, so 6 or 7, why do they taste different? Why do they taste different? How do you make these? That's the way for me to engage at that level of soul. At least that's how I've always understood science, and it's certainly how I understood science that involves something as important as you say, as history and as the emotional connection that all of us have with food and drink.
Yeah, I think there's a passage in your book where if you say, if you love something, my theory is you're supposed to ask what makes that thing tick. The way that you ask, the way that your book asks is a very different way than probably a lot of us are sort of familiar, which would be, it would be a story sort of tinged with romance about the tradition of whiskey making in like the Highlands, or bourbon aging in Kentucky, And so, you sort of address those things, but you, I think yesterday you said that you sort of, approach the reporting the same way as if you were reporting on like a wastewater plant or something like that. Like distilling.
It's true. I mean, the story that John's alluding to is what I had said that I as I was trying unsuccessfully to gain backstage access to a giant brewery, an industrial scale, transnationally owned brewery here in California, because I wanted to see the pipes that are big enough to fit a Volkswagen Beetle and the machinery and the control panels for making all of these things work that produce, amazingly enough, a product that tastes the same every time, year after year, oceans and oceans of this stuff that people all over the world drink, which is, not easy. If you've ever tried to brew beer at home, I dare you, to succeed at that level. And they really didn't want to let me in. And I think that the thing that probably clinched it for him was when I said, like, no, I mean, I think these places are they're amazing. I mean, they're like sewage treatment plants. They're like, they're like, look. And I meant that as a compliment. I really did. I mean, managing sewage for a city, like, that's not easy. And if you do it right, everybody has clean water. But they didn't. I don't think that AB InBev saw it the same way. But I meant it with appreciation, as you say, and it was completely misunderstood. They heard it as like, you think that what we're doing is, well, I mean, just to be really reductionist about it, you think what we're doing is science and not art. And I was saying, no, I think that what you're doing is both of those things. Is that not? We just never, it never worked.
Yeah. Did they disagree? I mean, they thought what were doing wasn't science, or?
Well, no, I think that the truth of it is, I think that a very good brewer knows full well that there's real science.
Right.
And I think that their marketing people know full well that they don't want to admit it. Because what happens when all of the very important things that you were describing, John, meet commercialism, then the emotional connections and the history and the traditions become a marketing layer on top of a product. So a place like Wild Turkey or Jack Daniel's, let's say, these massive distilleries producing hundreds of thousands of gallons of bourbon whiskey every year, and producing something really excellent. I mean, Wild Turkey 101 is, to me, one of the great American products. It's one of the great things that we make in the United States. But but make no mistake, it's an industrial process. It's industrialized chemistry at a massive scale, and that is not the way that Wild Turkey wants you to think about that bottle. They want you to think about it as old guys going up in the hills with a little still, which is not how you make Wild Turkey. And to me, the disconnect between that glass of brown liquid with ice that's so wonderful to drink, and how it's made and how you're supposed to think about making it, is a great storytelling tension.
Yeah, and certainly. It was probably Michael Pollan in The Omnivore's Dilemma who kind of wrote brilliantly about the way that Whole Foods as an example sort of bends story to like marketing.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of are sort of hungry to have a connection with we imagine these sort of local farmers. Never mind that industrial or organic is behind most of it. So Kenji does writing an 8-page recipe for meatloaf take the poetry out of it?
I mean, so to me, it's not. There's not this sort of sliding. There's not this scale with science on one side and art on the other, which I think some people have that idea that like a recipe is this artistic, which means that it's less scientific, or it's this scientific, which means that it's less artistic. To me, it's like two separate dials that you have, and you can treat them differently. And for me, the interesting story in a recipe or in writing, it can be something that's purely personal, something about experiences I've had. But to me, science is also an interesting story in and of itself, and you can have both of those things in the same story. In this particular book, I tended to play down the personal and play up the science, mainly because I didn't want the book to be about me. I wanted it to be about helping other people understand how to cook. So I was writing it for someone like my little sister who is smart, is interested in cooking, but doesn't really know where to start and doesn't know much about it. So to bring too much personal stuff into it, I think I think it would limit the usefulness of the book, because then it would be a book about me and not a book about cooking, which is really what it is. Which is not to say that I don't feel like, sometimes I have trouble expressing my emotions, my wife will say sometimes, but it doesn't mean that I don't feel them. I think, other writing that I do, I think has different degrees of personalness versus impersonalness. But to say that, I don't think it means that there's no story in it as well, because, I think, particularly with my background and a lot of the types of friends I have, there are people who are sort of really, really deeply into the science story behind things, and don't actually care much about like the farmer who raised the cow or whatever. I have a friend who says, eating a steak, like a lab-grown steak 20 years from now, if we can design in a lab, make a steak that has the perfect degree of marbling and the perfect whatever, like, to me that's actually pretty boring. Yeah. Because to me then the meat doesn't actually really have a story. It doesn't. I don't get to sort of make a connection with the formerly living thing in the land, or whatever it is that makes a steak interesting. But to that friend of mine, the science and the development that went into that science is the sort of interesting part of that story. So to say that like one type of story is, to sort of place a value judgment on, say, one type of story is better than the other kind, or like one is more emotional than the other one, I think is sort of unfair. And maybe that's sort of what's at the heart of this debate, is that for some people, I think that kind of science-based story doesn't really resonate on an emotional level, and so they assume that for people who it does, that people who it does resonate to are like emotionless shells of people who only care about science. But I think that's an unfair assessment.
I at risk of going full Vulcan here, I do think, here's where I lose the room. You ready? If you think that there is no emotional story behind the science, then you don't know enough science. Right. You have not studied it enough. Or nobody has taught it to you in the right way, or nobody has told you those stories. Part of the mission, to the extent that my book has a mission, part of that mission was to say, look at the stories that gave us, that let us understand this science. That's how you tell science stories. That's how I was trained. That's the state of the art in science writing. If you can pull that off, you've done a good job. So that idea that the story of the cow and the rancher that produced the steak is somehow a more emotional story than the story of the researcher in the lab who figured out how to get stem cells on a polymer scaffolding to produce a steak, that those two stories somehow are not equivalent are not compelling stories, that only one of them is compelling. And in fact, to ignore the vast amount of science that comes with the rancher and the steer is that's, to me, misguided.
And I mean, there is also, I think, two types of those science stories. So there's the story of the scientist and the development of that process, but there's also the story of like, what goes on in that steak when you're cooking it, which isn't something that, it's not something that is developed. It's not a technology that's developed. It's something that exists because of the laws of the universe. But I think that's also interesting to see, the laws of the universe are pretty interesting to me. And then the more we discover about them, the more interesting they become.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think the fear of the lab-created steak is a story with built-in drama.
Yeah.
But the sort of drama, the magic of cooking is traditional cooking with the farmer and the cow in the field, is that results are like different because the conditions, the cow itself, the conditions under which it was raised, the season it was raised, is going to vary. And so, in a way, food that has imperfection built into it is kind of beautiful just for that. Mm-hmm. And I think, is it misguided fear that sort of bold, modern, industrial science-based food is going to have less personality, is going to be somehow inferior to something that we've known traditionally?
Let me kind of build out a story in what you're talking about that's related to lab-grown meat, which is lab-built wine. It's something that we've been looking at in my office. There's a company that says, by the way, never trust stories that come after the words, there's a company that says. But there's a company that says that they can make synthetic wine. they sort of get a GCMS and they go, well, look, we know how much ethanol's in it, and we know how much water's in it, and we know some of the phenols and the esters and the aldehydes and the organic chemicals, and we sort of know what the fermentation process looks like. In the aging process, we know the wood contributes certain vanillins and tannins, and so we're going to take all those things from little vials and we're going to mix them together, and here's your glass of wine. It's going to taste like Cabernet, and they want to sell that, and so because it'd be cheaper and faster, and you could franchise it out like Coca-Cola and have local water, but syrups that they delivered. I don't know. I mean, you can imagine a business built out of that. You guys are already buying $2 Chuck anyway. It's basically similar. But here's the best part of this story is that when you taste it, as I understand it, we haven't got it in. I asked the writers to call it in. We got to taste it. But apparently, when you taste it, it doesn't taste like wine. Which doesn't surprise you, right? You're all nodding. You're like, well, duh. Why? Why doesn't it taste like wine? Well, the easiest answer is because nobody really knows what's in wine. And that is astonishing. Human beings have been making wine for 8,000 years. We don't know why it tastes the way it does. Why does wine taste the way it does? I have just incepted you into a science story. Why does wine taste like that? Why does synthetic wine not taste like that? What are the differences? Why do people taste things that way? So that's an emotional story to me. That's a story that all of us are, you're all going to go think about that when you have your glass of rosé at lunch today. Like, wow, I don't know, this rosé is delicious, and I don't know why. And don't care after the second one.
Do you think that's a sort of technological barrier, though? At some point, we're going to know what makes wine taste like wine, I think. That's a question that I think will be answered.
Me too. No, I think so too, and I think that will be fascinating. And then I think it will be, then once you can synthetic, it's all synthesis, but once you can, in a lab, make something that is indistinguishable from a 2012 Loire Valley.
In a blind taste test.
In a blind triangle, the three of us sitting up here, given a triangle test,
pick out the fake one.
Couldn't pick the fake one. Once that happens, then that's a quantum leap. That's a new world that you live in when that happens. Because then you have to ask if there's a qualitative difference between the two liquids that is solely based on provenance.
I think there is. The reality is that nobody tastes things blind, except unless you're doing tests like that. But nobody tastes things blind, and that's what marketing is largely about. You have to build in these stories to things, and it makes things taste different. It's like you can drink like the world's crappiest beer, but if you drink it like at the end of a 16-hour shift in a hot kitchen, it tastes way better than it does like first thing in the morning, maybe first most of it.
Well, that's like that's a whole different beer.
And similarly, in my book at the beginning, there's a section where I'm talking about eggs, and people are convinced that eggs that come from their backyard taste better than the eggs that you buy from the supermarket. In blind taste tests, most people cannot tell the difference. But as soon as you tell someone that this egg came from a chicken that leads a happy life, it's eating bugs, it's doing stuff chickens are supposed to do, it makes the egg taste better. And to some people, I think that may seem like, oh, it's a trick, it's not really better, it's just a trick. But it's not really a trick because taste is not just taste is not just something that you're perceiving on your tongue, not just something you're perceiving on your nose. It's the way that those signals go into your brain, and it's how your brain processes those things. So there's stuff that's built into your brain that's going to affect the way that you interpret the signals that are coming in from your sensory apparatus. And so in that sense, I think we're never going to be able to replicate a steak or replicate wine because it inherently has a different story and it has a different meaning to us. I just trailed off, but yeah.
No.
It's a good trail.
The question for me is, or maybe the question for you is like, what is wine? Looked at one way, wine is, something that one could make synthetically. For me, wine is the experience of like driving to Kermit Lynch, sort of walking through the store, talking to somebody who works there, feeling like I have this deep connection with the story of this wine, that it reflects, certain characteristics of winemaking that have happened in a region in France for hundreds and hundreds of years, and I can't taste that. I'm sure that I can't taste that. I'm sure in a blind tasting I'd be humiliated, but but that story is a big part of what makes wine for me. What defines wine for me.
Let me argue by analogy a little bit, because I do think that's important, but I think when you're talking about those distinctions, you're on intersecting axes. They're related, or overlapping magisteria, let's say. So around the corner, there's a comic book store. Fantastic Comics. It's my local. I've been reading comics since I was 6 years old, so 40 years of comics. And I read I read the indie stuff and the good stuff, but I also read like cheeseball, superhero, garishly clad men and women punching evil people with purple faces kind of comic books, and I have my whole life. And those stories are meaningful to me. With great power comes great responsibility, and rocketed to Earth with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men are like foundational tales for me, okay? And so those things are meaningful to me. I've also, as a reporter, I've covered a lot of nerd stuff. I've interviewed a lot of the people who make the movies and write the comic books, and I know about the backstories of how, maybe Stan kind of stole some of the stories from Jack and that kind of stuff. I know those stories. I know a little bit about how the new computer-controlled color process works, how there aren't really hand colors anymore, that they use computers, and there are no more letterers, hand letterers. It's mostly done by computer too. Those are all stories about comic books. They all mean something to me, and they're all true, but they're different ways of looking at the issue. And I think that's okay. Those are different kinds of slices of the pie. To go use a food metaphor about a comic book metaphor I was using to talk about food. I think that's all right. And I wouldn't privilege any one of those stories over the other. They're all different stories that I can tell myself about whether Spider-Man will beat the Green Goblin.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was going to say, related to what, back to lab steaks and wine. So I think some people have this sort of misconception that science has an agenda, that like the end goal of science is the lab-grown steak or the lab-made wine. And to me, like, so that's one of these. That's when I know that someone, I think, doesn't understand what science is. So the way I try to explain is that, like, if science is not, so science is really just sort of like a map, like an atlas. So like if I'm writing a recipe, and most recipes, what they are is a series of step-by-step instructions that start at one point and lead you to another point, and that's just like turn-by-turn directions. You put it into your phone, and it tells you how to get there, and you get there. And to me, that's the prescriptivist approach. Like having a written recipe and just following it, that's prescriptivist to me. What science does is it allows you to zoom out and see, why am I taking these turns? Like maybe I can take an alternate route to get there, or say my starting ingredients are slightly different. How am I going to take them? What turns should I take to get them to the same endpoint, or how do I get to a different endpoint? And it's not like having this map is forcing you to go one way or another. It's actually quite the opposite. It gives you it empowers you as the user, as the map reader, to decide where you want to go. And so that's what science is like. The more knowledge you have, the more details you're filling in on that map, and the more choices you have about where you start and where you want to end up. So when somebody says, "Oh, I don't like the prescriptivist approach to this science book," or whatever, I think that's sort of a fundamental misunderstanding of what science is, and maybe that's my fault, or whatever science writer's fault, for not explaining it properly.
I might even go, just to like really climb on a really high horse. I find it a little bit insulting, the notion of like that someone could read your work and suggest that you don't love cooking enough, which is really that's really what the argument is. Saying like, no, he's not feeling it. Like, well, I've read your stuff, and that's dumb. That's a dumb argument. That's not cool. And similarly, I think it's sort of insulting to say that your Nana in the kitchen, who alters her famous bread recipe depending on whether it's humid out or not, is not using science. She is. Even if she doesn't define it the same way that a food chemist down at UC Davis would, that's what's going on in there. It's disingenuous to say that when you're cooking, you're not using science. You might not notice or admit or recognize, but like it doesn't work unless you do.
It's when you get the new toaster, you have to dial in the number, right? And it's like if you can cook it at 6, and you're like, that's too brown. Then you cook it at 3, and that's too light. And then finally you get it. You're like, okay, this new toaster, I want 4.5 toast. And that's science.
You have done science now. Yes. That's all it is. That's right.
But there, there was a conversation, I think, at the San Francisco Cooking School recently with Harold McGee and Daniel Patterson, the chef. And kind of what I came away from that, I sort of read about it, and but was that sort of getting a firm grasp on what's happening while you're cooking can be a way to allow you to cook more intuitively, because once you understand what's going on, then you can sort of take off on your own. You don't have to follow, 8 pages of steps. You can sort of freestyle, once you know the principles of what's going on. But the other thing I wanted to say or ask you guys is that what your books are these sort of beautiful, in a way, arguments for sort of science and a technical approach. But I think what's made them popular is that they are things that don't really have much to do with science. I mean, Kenji, you have this very charming, engaging, kind of nerdy personality that comes through really strongly. And so...
I mean, I tell a lot of dad jokes.
Yeah, like dad jokes, sort of, kind of wincing, sort of puns that make you wince. But it feels really fresh and charming. And I would bet that, your fandom has as much to do with that as with the actual sort of prescriptive parts of the recipes. And Adam, with you, it's excellent journalism. I mean, you have this very engaging voice, and it's beautifully reported.
Thank you.
So it's kind of like the packaging that you guys are sort of presenting your message in is itself very engaging. So, were you aware of that when you were sort of writing? I mean, were you aware that would sort of, maybe sort of ease people's fears about science?
So for me, I mean, so there's 2 things that I was very aware of. So one of them was trying to make it light and reasonably funny. And I think that, as far as when I'm writing something, whether it's a story online or the book, like making it funny and fun to read is by far the hardest part. Like that's the stuff I work hardest on, like trying to think of more clever analogies or whatever, some funnier references or something that's going to get people to connect. That was one element that I was really aware of. And the other element that I was strongly aware of is that, if I'm going to make these lessons about science engaging, then, so the recipe selection was one of the big things for me. I don't cook most of the stuff in the book. Like I don't eat macaroni and cheese or meatloaf, honestly. Like the last time I made meatloaf was when I made like 50 of them doing the research in the book. So I don't really eat the way the book does, but a lot of people do, right? And so for me, like, to come at it from the science angle and to also like say like, by the way, like this is my recipe for mapo tofu, which maybe people in this room love, but most of the people in America don't really know what it is. It's like there's too many unfamiliar things, and there's not really anything that people can latch onto. So I made like a very conscious decision. Okay, like this is going to be a book about meatloaf and mashed potatoes, like something that is going to give people like, maybe I'm not interested in science, but I'm really interested in meatloaf, and then they kind of learn the science in the process. So sort of the meatloaf is like the I always think, the meatloaf is like the cheese sauce, and the science is like the broccoli that you're hiding in there, and humor. It's all just about engaging the audience and making sure that there's something interesting to read there, and so that by the time they're done reading something that is fun to read, then they accidentally learn things while they're doing it too.
Right.
I was very conscious of having two audiences, both of whom I was playing a little bit of a trick on. When I was pitching the book, I said, look, this is going to be a science book that will be about booze, and it's going to be a booze book that will have some science in it. With the whole time my kind of double secret probation plan being like, well, I'm going to do some rock solid, I'm going to try to do some rock solid science journalism, do the journalism to explain some really, really hard science, drawing my examples from things that people can find behind a bar. So the book has, some of my favorite parts of the book are like metallurgy And there's a lot of hard neuroscience in there. There's some pretty good biochemistry. There's a lot of fun history. I didn't know I was going to do that much history, but I got into it, and all of it gets kind of. Your analogy was cheese sauce and broccoli, and I guess I would say like, that it's all mixed in, but the main the base spirit is just rye. Like it's all in a cocktail, and you sort of don't notice the vegetables, I guess. That was really important to me. That I wanted to be able to do this hard science, to explain it in a way that people would understand, and in fact in a way that they didn't even feel the needle go in.
Is anyone making broccoli cocktails?
Man.
I think, I don't know about broccoli,
Kale
but
cocktails there must be.
kale, like celery root, yeah.
I haven't tried that.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that, part of the problem and something that you guys had to battle against was just that we have really crappy science education, in America, and so there is this feeling like, science is kind of soulless, not appealing, scary. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that it's bad science education. I think one of the problems is scientists. I think there's scientific snobbery that only real scientists can do science, and you see this sometimes in in stories about science. I'm sure this comes up in Wired also, where people write about science, and then somewhere in the comments a real scientist comes in and says, "Oh, this isn't science. This is bullshit." And it's like you're not helping your cause by trying to turn other people off to what you're doing, right? So I don't know. I think a lot of the problem is that there is this sort of scientific snobbery. But I honestly, I think at least in popular media, I think it's getting better than it used to be. That a show like MythBusters can be so popular, or or like Alton Brown had a show for years. So I think popular science, I think, is doing pretty well, and a lot of that has to do with the internet and making it easier for people to find good science writing and science shows and things like that.
And blowing stuff up. I mean,
blowing stuff up makes it cool.
Why you watch MythBusters?
Have you seen the hydraulic press channel on YouTube? It's just pushing stuff under a hydraulic press. It's pretty cool.
Science. All right, maybe my snobbery is showing a little bit too. Here's a super writerly way to think about this if you want. Most scientific journal articles are the voice is passive. They are, just to double up on this joke, they are written in the passive voice, which is to say that you don't know who an actor is in it. The centrifuge was run at, the cells were extracted from. So that's from a pure writing perspective. That's how science expresses itself to itself. Which is to say, in its most official form, it removes the human actor, because it's trying to express, as an institution, it's trying to express a fundamental rule of the universe. It's trying to say, well, a human didn't have a finger on the scale here. This is a thing that happened because we are telling you the truth about how things happen. And that's important. It's good. I spend a significant portion of my day humiliating writers and extracting passive voice from their writing. Don't do that. The car was not moved. Someone moved the car. Tell me who. That's part of your job. And it's part of your job to use a more active verb, because people like reading active verbs. It makes your writing feel better. So please fix this passive voice that you put. So that's not just a different folk way. That's a different way of seeing the universe and expressing it. And I think taking science, part of my job is taking science and putting it in the active voice, because that makes people who aren't scientists able to understand it and want to read it. I would say that there is one of the faults, to the extent that science as an institution has a fault here in connecting with a non-scientific and a non-science speaking world, as Kenji was talking about, is folks, let's try some active voice. Let's acknowledge that there are human beings trying to understand an amazing, a remarkable universe. That's what the process is, and when we express it to people, when that somehow manages to get across to a kid, they become a scientist when they realize that. We don't always express it that well. I was trying to do that in the book.
Yeah. No, I mean, I feel the same way. That I think, you know, my job, and I think the thing that I'm good at, you know, is not like, I'm not a scientist. I'm not really a cook anymore. But I do, you know, I consider myself a science writer, and my job is to take relatively complicated and sort of sometimes boring, at least boringly presented scientific facts, and then turn them into something that's useful to people and also interesting to people. And I think, you know, that's what I spend most of my day doing.
Right. And I think what, you know, for me, one of the takeaways from both of your books was this, and the thing that made me less scared about thinking about science, I suppose,
Yay!
is feeling that they exist in some way to sort of bring or explain or deliver sort of pleasure and delight, which is something that I understand very well. And in a way, you know, there's so much bad sort of traditional storytelling. You know, there's so many unsatisfying stories of, you know, where the cow was raised. So many stories now that I probably don't trust. That it's kind of refreshing to think of, you know, to sort of look and see how, you know, bourbon is actually sort of distilled and aged. That's kind of comforting in a way. And it's like, you know, the question is, can it still bring the same delight, you know, when I'm sitting when I'm sitting in a bar?
But let me, well, two things. I would say I have a little bit of an advantage writing about booze rather than food, in the sense that bars and the consumption of alcohol really do reward a certain know-it-allism. That maybe it's a smaller proportion of the food consuming community. You know, pushing up your glasses and saying "actually" in a bar is kind of tradition. It's the same thing as buying a round. That's, you know, it's like actually, and I do take a certain delight in that know-it-allism, I will acknowledge. But I would, you know, I might also like kind of try to poke a finger through some of the self-inflated food and food/travel writing, where the only way to extract a narrative from it is that the experience of it changes the writer's understanding of the world in some way, which I find to be its own sort of know-it-allism and self-importance. The idea that, like, now that I've met the cow, I really understand how my food works. Like, I don't care if you understand your food. That's not my, you know, no matter how beautifully you've written it, what you've done is, using elegant words, you've lured me into the memoir. And I didn't buy that ticket. And that's my problem. That's me. I mean, that's, you know, a lot of people read memoir and love that, and a lot of people read travel and like the delight and the beautiful descriptions of the places. But I for me, as a personal matter, I want more. I want to know, well, why does it look like that? Tell me that story. And so, since nobody had with booze, once I noticed that, I realized I had a book to write. It was great.
Yeah. And it's important to, I mean, note that those two things are not mutually exclusive.
Totally.
Right? You can have a good travel story that is also gives you the why.
And I'm intentionally being a jerk about it here too. Like I see that. Like I'm pushing on that to make a point, but just to say, like, there is a different kind of story that has more of an appeal for me. But it is, but yes, also, you know, you tell them and I tell them. There's travel stories, there's memoir, there's the way that you tell the story is ultimately is going to be personalized.
Yeah. All right, I think it might be time to field some questions. So I think there were, yes, I see the microphones being collected. All right.
What do we do? Do people just scream if you want a microphone?
Are you going to pick, or you going to let them do it? How would we?
Let's see.
Hi, so thank you both for your talks and all that. It's very interesting. So I'm a researcher in complex systems, and a question that I struggle with a lot is, do you think that kind of scientific reductionism, so picking things apart and testing variables and all that, at like a very basic level, can give us an understanding of the world where we could say that we would totally like understand or grok it, like in the words of Heinlein?
Will scientific reductionism, are you asking, can that eventually lead to a perfect understanding of the world? Oh, no, I mean, well, I think that's one of the basic principles of good science is that you should never be happy with where we are right now.
Scientists are never happy. Have you met these people? Come on.
I mean, there's always more to learn. But you know, I think, I mean, reductionism, I think it depends on the context. You know, with food, there is the danger that if you just reduce it down to its variables, you end up with this sort of sterile story, and that your food ends up not being interesting. And I think to some degree, like, you know, some of the sort of pseudoscientific, like molecular gastronomy type stuff that was going on 5 to 15 years ago is an example of that, where the food just became about the story of how we did this, as opposed to having other elements, and as opposed to thinking about how people are going to experience and the sort of the whole perception of taste and whatever in your brain. So, but I don't think, I think most people don't think about it that way. You know, like, yeah, I certainly don't think about it that way. Like, you know, when I'm researching recipes, the first thing I do is always ask myself what the recipe means to me, like what this particular dish means to me, and then also what it means to other people and the history of the dish. Because the last thing you want to do is end up with a meatloaf that is like technically perfect, but when people try it, they're like, that's not quite meatloaf, you know. And maybe that's the wine element. Like you don't want to end up somewhere where where there's no emotional attachment at all and where there's no story, because then that's a boring food to me. It's not. It's missing a certain element that makes it what it is. So I guess that's the danger of reductionism, at least in food science. But on the other hand, you know, understanding things on a very minute level, it's sort of like if you're a musician, right? Like practicing your scales, or like learning some basic theory. Is not going to make you a worse musician just because you're only focusing on the scales. It's just something, it's like a tool that adds to your background understanding of what you're doing, and how you're interpreting it, and how you're producing your music. So it's like, you know, like what John said before, that, you know, the more understanding you have, I think the more you're sort of able to riff on it and be a little bit freer in the kitchen. I don't know if any of my answers related to your question.
You know, because you work in complex systems, the old distinction, lumpers versus splitters, that you can break almost any group, but science in particularly, into the people whose work is about synthesis and finding connections, and the people whose work is about doing finer and finer grain splitting apart. These are both noble pursuits. I think probably as a journalist, I tend to be a lumper. I'm trying to find patterns and through lines, and sometimes that through line is story, and sometimes that through line is a scientific pattern. But I think that goes for writing, and it goes for food especially. That these are again, overlapping magisteria. They are different ways of understanding the same thing. It is totally okay to understand, you know, the recipe for chicken soup that got handed down in your family in matzo balls for, you know, 5 generations, to understand it as the way to connect with your great-great-grandmother, as well as a way to understand how starches unfold in heat.
Yeah, and you know, my understanding of like Harold McGee is that he's you know, able to sort of synthesize this sort of literature, you know, the sort of poetry of food with actual science.
The McGee book is a great example of this, because I think that one of the key things to notice about On Food and Cooking is what's not in it, which is recipes. Right? There's no recipes in McGee's book. And that is why there are no cocktail recipes in mine. Because I'm like, not about that. I'm not trying to teach people how to make drinks. I'm trying to teach people why to make drinks. And I think Harold would kind of say that too. Like, he's trying to get at the underpinnings, the infrastructure, the world behind the world. Yeah. And I don't think that's just breaking things down into smaller and smaller parts until they're irreducible. I think that's a different kind of synthesis. For me, that was. I don't know, Kenji, is that your experience of McGee's work too? Like,
yeah, no, it is. I think one, and I'm not saying that this is a fault in McGee's book, because it's my most used book, but I think one of the elements that I think some people have connecting with McGee's book is that it's not immediately obvious unless you've been cooking for a while how to apply what's in it to, like how to make it applicable and how to apply it to your cooking. And so it's useful for a certain type of person who's been cooking a lot. Very useful for chefs. Interesting if you're just a fan of science writing. But the fact that it doesn't have recipes, I think, is something that makes it difficult for some people to access because they're like, okay, well, this is what happens when a steak cooks, but then how do I use that to cook a better steak?
Yeah, no, that's true.
Ready for another question?
Yes, we're ready.
Oh, how about up here?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi. I'm curious why you think that there's such contradictory advice about cooking very basic things. For instance, beans. Do you dump the soaking, from a science perspective, do you dump the soaking liquid? And these are from our authoritative cooks, seemingly. Do you dump the soaking liquid or not? Do you add salt before it's almost done or not? So why is that the case, that there seems to be real contradictions? And then what are some of your favorite examples?
Well, so I think it's similar to so I drive my wife to the bus stop every morning where she gets on the bus. It's about a 10-minute drive from our place, and there's two routes you can take. We can either go down Camino Real or we can go down 25th Avenue. And I'm convinced that going down Camino Real is the faster way to do it on average, and she's convinced that 25th Avenue is the faster way to do it on average. And every morning we get into this little fight when we're at the point where you make that turn, like, do we do it this way or do we do it that way? Usually we do it my way because I'm the one driving. But I don't have any backup for why I think my way is faster. Like, I haven't sat there and timed both methods and actually seen which one is on average faster. I'm just convinced it is. And I know that if I go this way, I'm probably going to get there on time. And so I think that a lot of it is that, it's that the way cooking is passed down, it's like if something works, then it works, and there's no reason, for a lot of people, there's no reason to question that. It's like, I know, like, throwing out my bean liquid and replacing it makes me a pot of beans that tastes good. I don't know if it tastes better than if I saved the bean liquid, but I've never tried it, and I know that this way works, so why does it matter? And I think that's actually a perfectly fine way to cook. I think it's perfectly fine if you're happy with the results of your dish and you've been doing it the same way forever and you've never tried it another way. I think that's fine. It's not the way I like to do things. But as I just proved myself, like it is the way I do things in other parts of my life. I guess some good examples are, well, beans. I've had many chefs who told me, like, oh, don't salt the bean water because the beans will never soften. Turns out it's not true, and it's actually quite the opposite. The skins soften better if you salt the water, and if you soak them in salted water at night, overnight when you're salting them. The enemy of beans is actually acid because it inhibits pectin breakdown in the skins. That's one. There's. I think generally, like, the more sort of like manly a food is, the more deep, or the more Italian, the more sort of deeply held myths there are about it. So like, there's tons of myths about cooking steak, like flipping them only once, or there's myths about cooking pasta and like the amount of water you have to use and things like that. Italian food, it's really crazy. Like, anytime you write anything about Italian food, like, it's guaranteed that in the comments there's going to be, oh, like, my nonna made it this way, and and it's funny because everybody's grandmother made it differently. So so I've taken to writing sometimes in these Italian food recipes, like, this is like not your specific grandmother's red sauce, and that's fine.
That's why there were all those city-state wars in Italy for all those centuries.
Yeah, there you go.
All the grandmothers, the red sauce recipes. I actually have, because of Kenji's book, started putting salt in the eggs that I've beaten and letting them rest before putting them onto the heat, which I had stopped putting salt in. I was like, don't put the salt in the eggs. You can't put salt in eggs when you scramble. I make a lot of eggs. I have a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old. We eat a lot of eggs, and now that's changed thanks to Kenji. Now there's salt in them again, which is it's like a revelation in my house. Most of the advice or instructions, rules, whatever, for making cocktails, especially if you look online, is actually aimed at bartenders, and bartenders have a different goal than you do at home because they're trying to work fast and at scale. So, for example, for a while I was buying jiggers to use in my house because they're beautiful, and I was buying nicer and nicer ones. And then I realized, you know what? I don't really use these very well. I spill, and I'm not trying to make 9 mojitos fast on a Friday night.
Bar back to clean up for you.
And I don't have a bar back, and I don't have somebody cutting all the. I'm like, no, I'm using a measuring cup from now on. I'm not gonna do that. This is ridiculous. It's like all the jiggers are gone from my bar over in the corner. That's, so there's a difference in goals. And I think Kenji's example about going different directions. Like, this is why I use Waze. I go a different way every time. I let the computer tell me now, and it predicts the future. It can tell me whether there's traffic. I love that. I think that there's different. You're trying to get to a different place sometimes.
I think that point about the difference between like cooking professionally and cooking at home is actually one that comes up a lot in recipes, and why like chefs generally write the worst recipes for home cooks, because they just come from a completely different background with a different set of starting goals and parameters, different type of equipment. So like for instance, I think that's actually where the whole like only flip your steak once thing came from. It's like if you're working in a steakhouse and you're cooking 40 steaks at a time, you don't want to sit there flipping them over and over and over. So you put them out, you put them down once. You know that when you flipped it once, that this one's okay, about halfway done, and it's much easier to keep track of everything that way. But at home, you're cooking maybe 4, 6 steaks at a time at most. Plus, you're only doing it maybe a couple times a year, so you don't have that sort of like natural sense sense of just looking at it and touching it, the sense of feel that you develop by doing it every night forever. So you have. It's a different style of cooking, and you have a different set of end goals, which is, I think you can actually produce a better steak at home than you can get in a steakhouse, because you can focus on those 4 steaks and make sure that you're flipping them repeatedly. You're building up a nice brown crust on the outside. You're doing it in a way that with a type of attention and a type of attention to detail, and with a certain type of knowledge that the restaurant cook actually can't give that steak.
At home, you can stir your drink in ice with your finger. Nobody says nothing. It's my drink.
I just pour the 2 spirits in.
You just keep
swish them around in my mouth.
Totally kosher.
Suck on an ice cube after.
That's a fine tradition.
All right, well, like a previous questioner, I'm also a scientist, and I'm actually getting my PhD in heat transfer. So I had a mini science-gasm when you started talking about like convection and conduction in your book, Kenji. That was exciting.
Don't tell me everything I got wrong. But
it was good. You did a good job explaining it to the public.
And then I want to talk about copper and stills after you've done asking your question.
Oh, it'll be great. We can have a little chat. But my question might actually take you maybe a little bit out of your comfort zone, but I've been celiac for well over a decade. And one of the interesting things that I've always searched for in books is the science behind, when you replace a flour with, a dozen alternative flours, what's actually happening. It could be the heat transfer, it could be the chemistry of what's going on. And I'm curious if, either of you or if you know anyone that's actually really trying to look in the same sort of, constructive way that you break down the science into that, gluten-free or even just allergen-free baking or cooking.
that is out of my comfort zone. I mean, actually, honestly, don't have an answer to that question. I mean, I know there are other people sort of like me who are pop science writers and not actual lab scientists who are who theorize about things like that and write about it. I'm sure that there are lab scientists hired by big flour companies who are trying to develop better gluten-free flour replacements who do this actual real work, who do the real science. But I'm not a real scientist.
It comes up increasingly in the spirits and beer and wine world too, of course, because in beer it's an issue, and in some of the distilled spirits folks are making it an issue by pointing out that their vodka is gluten-free when in fact it has been for 2,000 years. But I had a conversation with the guy who's basically the best beer scientist in the world, and he was talking about a gluten-free beer that they were working on. But he said, we were looking at some just regular beer, and I'm not really sure there's gluten in that either. Like it's still these are open questions in science, which I would say, like, if you're a science journalist, is actually pretty exciting because that means there's stories to tell. It's not so useful for someone who's celiac, I'm afraid.
Any other questions? Hi, yeah, I actually am an editor, not a scientist, and so I was curious, Kenji, when you said that you don't think of the science and the story as being separate, and you think of them as two separate dials that you adjust. But in the reality of writing, there are word limits and there are things that you're supposed to target. And so does the science ever get diluted or cut in the way that you both of you write about things in order to preserve more story? Or how does that balance actually translate when you have to have a 500-word story?
Yeah. Well, so there's there's a couple answers to that question. The first is that I did most of my writing online, where there's less of this sort of real estate limit.
Oh my God.
Also, I mean, look how thick my book is, so my editor didn't really cut that much. So no, but I mean, I think the real answer is for me, in order for a story to be successful, and in order for me to sort of like brand it as like a food lab story, because I write some stories that aren't real food lab stories, but in order for me to call it like a food lab story, you have to answer the why, and that can be as little as like one sentence that explains basically, or it can dive much deeper into it. But whatever it is, like I don't want people coming away thinking like, well, he didn't explain that. You know, he said do this, but he didn't tell me why I'm doing that. Because to me, for me, that's like the most frustrating part about growing up and learning things. Like when someone just told me just do it, like that, do it because I say like that. I just don't like authority in that sense. Like I want to let the universe tell me what to do as opposed to a teacher or a professor. So that's the basic criteria for me. Like there has to be that why, and the why has to make sense. And then from there I can decide, you know, whether it's going to be all about the why, which sometimes it is, and those stories are actually usually more difficult to write because you have to make it all about the why, but also exciting and interesting, or whether it's just going to be an aside that explains the why.
I have always been, I trained most of my career in print, and I have always been pretty intense structuralist as an approach. So like, no, here's how you're going to put this together. Here's how I'm going to put this together so that it will have the elements that I need, and also have some entertainment, some compelling reason for the reader to begin and then to keep reading. Having spent the last couple of years more focused online, where it is true that the lack of a word count, the internet turns out to be an insatiable maw. You can't, you can always write more, and sometimes that really jeopardizes a single piece of writing, because there's that moment of sort of in the third quarter of the piece where the writer will go, and here are other things I also know. You might want to cut that section. But what you do end up looking for online, I think, is a certain kind of propulsive musicality, maybe a little bit different than we used to do in print, that does have a different rhythm, but still a rhythm of moving back and forth, ideally in a way that the seams are invisible between narrative and exposition, and in some cases some really hard science that transcends just exposition and becomes like, we're going to do a little spade work here, folks. But that, as an editor, I think you would probably say the same as I would, which is that challenge is part of the fun. If it was easy, everybody'd do it.
I'd also want to add that, on the other side of that equation, a story. The other main criteria I have for a story, other than explaining the why, is that a story has to be a story, in that it has to have a beginning, middle, and end. It has to have some kind of climax and resolution and conflict, and it has to be something that is interesting. So whether the story is about baking chocolate chip cookies or about taking a trip to Mexico or whatever, like there has to be a story element to it that has a real arc.
Yeah, +1.
So I am a recent Berkeley transplant, so if this is a bad thing to say as someone in Berkeley, I'm going to apologize in advance. But I really loved Kenji's recent defense of American cheese. And I thought it was an interesting sort of note in the bigger food conversation of everything needs to be perfect and fresh and organic and GMO-free and all of these things. And I'd love to hear sort of from both of you your thoughts on the purist notion of food and how that does American cheese tastes good on a burger, and like just accepting that fact sometimes. So.
Well, yeah, okay. So I mean, it's to say it tastes good, it tastes bad is not really that interesting to me, because that's just down to a matter of taste, and there's lots of elements that come into play there. But I think a lot of people who say, oh, but American cheese is processed, like, all cheese is processed. Like that's a fact of cheese. You process milk and turn it into cheese. We actually understand that process quite well now. We don't understand exactly what makes a specific cheese in the same sense that we don't understand all the products of fermentation in wine. But we have a pretty good understanding of why cheese gets the texture it does, and because we have that understanding, we can then add to that process and make a different style of cheese. And so I think one of the problems is that some people have this idea that that food is perfect now, right? That cheese is done. Like we've reached the end point of cheese.
Peak cheese.
Or the same thing, like people who are like, oh, like this recipe is not authentic because it's not how it was done 100 years ago. Well, you know what? Like it's what they were doing 100 years ago wasn't what they were doing 400 years ago. Maybe with some cheeses it's true, but I don't want to harp on the Italians, but they didn't have tomatoes in Italy 500 years ago, and people complain about altering. It's like recipes change, people's cooking techniques change, processes change, and so to say that like something is not good, inherently not good, just because it's more processed than it was before, I think is a faulty argument. You can say it's not good because I don't like the taste, or it's not good because we're importing our whey protein concentrate from China where there aren't as good food safety standards, and maybe it's killing babies. Like you can say things like that, and those are valid arguments. But to say like the concept of American cheese is a bad concept because it's processed, I think that comes from a position of not knowing what processed means, and then not realizing that food evolves and does change.
I might even go farther out on a limb and say that I think one of the most delicious things there is to drink is Coca-Cola. It's a fantastic drink. It's really good. I think probably all of us could agree that maybe the business practices of Coca-Cola are not where we'd like to come down as human beings, and that it's not a healthy thing to drink often or even perhaps rarely. And that like if you want to talk about processed, like that Coca-Cola may well be the apotheosis of human technology.
Velveeta.
Okay, so not apotheosis. What's second? Is there a penultimate apotheosis? Is there a I don't know what the second to the apotheosis secondary is, but and yet it's quite delicious, and I think that's sort of I think about that kind of a lot, especially when I'm drinking Coca-Cola, about what that means for what we think about processed and what's authentic. What's authentic? Because like authentic Coca-Cola, and that may be what's behind the Mexican Coke thing, where it's like, well, if it's got real sugar in it, that's obviously better Coca-Cola. It's like sort of a weird.
Right, like pure, yeah.
Yeah, pure, more authentic Coca-Cola somehow. It's like, well, if you really want authentic Coca-Cola, you know what it used to have in it.
We have time for one more question, and afterwards we'll need to clear the room, but there'll be a chance to talk to the authors in the lobby and book purchases. So this is our last question.
Sorry.
Hey, I'm not a scientist either. I'm a research chef. I work in product development, and I'm just curious, pulse flowers, crickets, meatless proteins, what do you think we'll be eating 15 years from now?
We'll be eating 15 years from now.
You all look delicious.
It's people.
Well, in 15 years we'll still be eating meat, probably a lot more of it than we should be. Like, when we're eating more meat than we should be right now, and I think that's a trend. That's not, at least on an average global scale. In Berkeley, you'll probably be eating less meat than you do right now. But on a global scale, we'll be eating way more meat than we're eating now. I mean, 15 years is a pretty small timeline. But yeah, at some point, we're going to have to develop either more efficient ways of raising animals, and hopefully more efficiency doesn't come also with more cruelty, or some kind of synthetic thing, because like honestly, it's like, does someone eating the hamburger from McDonald's like care about the story behind the cow there? In as much as they want to make sure that people say they wanted to have been humanely raised, probably. They care about that part of the story, but they don't care which specific ranch it came from. And the meat doesn't taste like it came from a specific, that's actually their whole formula. It tastes the same no matter what part of the world you're in, no matter where the beef is coming from, like it tastes the same. So if you can synthesize that beef and somehow convince everyone in the world that it's safe and it tastes the same, then at some point I think that we will cross that line, or we're all going to be screwed, because we can't keep eating the way we're eating and continuing to grow in population.
I have hopes for new crops for things that are perennial instead of seasonal, and for plants that we don't currently think of as being a large commercial crop, sort of ground nut type stuff. I'm hopeful for those kind of things, and I think that a lot more of what we eat is going to be genetically modified. I think we're going to start doing a lot of that, and I think we won't have a choice if we want to keep feeding the planet because of climate change and because of changing conditions and more people who want it.
The other side of that is we're never going to reach an equilibrium, right? Like humans have this way of whatever resources we have and whatever technology we have, we push it a little bit beyond where it should go, and then we continuously have to find new ways. I mean, I think any animal will do that actually, but we're going to continue. It's going to be a continuous struggle. We're never going to be at the point where it's like, we finally have enough food for everybody and we can do what we want. It's not going to happen.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I wanted to, just thank these guys, Adam Rogers and Kenji, for producing really amazing books. So anyway, thanks.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.